Good morning, fellow ruminators, and welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to be engaged in very important matters of concern. Now, this morning, we are going to talk about diversity, inclusion, and equity, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? That's the word that is often used in the media. Now, I must confess that, every time this acronym DEI was used, I tended not to understand. I said, what are they talking about? What is this DEI that they're talking about? Americans like to use acronyms. And sometimes I struggle with my acronyms. I have to go back and, refer to them and to see what they signify. So this morning, we are going to look at these, concepts, right? These, shall we say, word salads. I hope people don't say that I'm trying to be disrespectful of this diversity, equity, and inclusion process. From I was pursuing PhD studies, I understood that there was a move or there was a push for diversity, equity, and inclusion in our world. Now, oftentimes people use these terminologies, but they are not aware what these terminologies mean, right? And it's very important when we're using words that we define them succinctly, right? And that people know what they mean, or else we will not be able to know what we're supporting or what we are not supporting. And sometimes, what we're supporting might not necessarily be what people think they are supporting, right? Because there might be lots of double standards and other implied meanings that people are not aware of, they're not cognizant of, right? So let's delve into that concept of diversity. Now, this writer here has presented a number of concepts, right? So we have a number of acronyms too. So we have D and I, right? And D and I stands for diversity and inclusion, right? So D and I stands for diversity and inclusion, right? So that's what you need to understand. Now, we also have DEI, which is often used in the media, and that means diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we also have DIB, and that's diversity, inclusion, and belonging, right? I wasn't aware of this one. And the other, which also I wasn't aware of, is DEB, which is diversity, equity, and belonging, right? So they sound like that they're identical, but they're not identical. And we shall delve now into the different meanings of these terminologies or these words. Now, the first one is diversity. What is diversity, right? As you shall, I'm sure you are interested in knowing. Acknowledges, so diversity acknowledges all the ways people differ. So their race and their sex and their gender and their age and their sexual orientation, disability, socioeconomic status, religious beliefs, and more. So you acknowledge. Now, there's a difference between acknowledging, but let's leave that for now, and accepting, all right? But let's leave that for now. We shall come back to that later in our video. Now, inclusion, it means, is about diversity in practice. It's the act of welcoming, supporting, respecting, and valuing all individuals and groups, right? I shall repeat that. Inclusion is about diversity in practice, right? So this is the theory in practice, all right? The theoretical framework of diversity in practice. It's the act of welcoming, supporting, respecting, and valuing all individuals and groups. Now, what are the consequences if I do not accept, right, or welcome, or support, right, or value all individuals and groups? And is that really possible to do? Can we respect and value, right, and welcome and support all groups, right? I don't think we all share similar values, and we've got to understand that. But this is what they're pushing. Now we have equity now, and is often used interchangeably with equality. But there's a core difference, and where equality is a system which each individual is offered the same opportunities regardless of circumstance, equity distributes resources based on needs. So we live in a disproportionate society, and equity tries to correct its imbalance by creating more opportunities for people who have historically had less access. One of the things that I find quite amazing about these terminologies, I'd like to know who is behind this movement, or who are the people who are supporting these movements. You know, whether we like it or not, those of us who live in the Western society, we know that we are governed by the economic theoretical framework of capitalism, right? And everything, just about everything that we do, some financial interest is behind it, right? Whether it be science or religion or education, right? You are going to have some amount of financial support, some amount of financial backing. And the question is, the pivotal question is, who is behind this movement of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Certainly, it cannot be, well, we hope, well, we if it is that if we think the capitalists are the ones who are behind it, these billionaires and these elite, these global elites, right? Then can they talk to us? Can they teach us about diversity, equity, and inclusion? That's the question. Because when we look at the wars being waged, that they're also behind, right? And the fact that they go and kill hundreds of thousands of people around the world, right? How can they possibly teach us about diversity, equity, and inclusion when they don't believe in that? Because in the first place, most of the wars would not have been waged if they were practicing those, or putting those words into practice, right? Because you preach by what? By word and precept, right? So they have to set for us the example, which if we look carefully at what is happening in the world, we are understanding, or we do understand, that these global elites do not practice what they preach, right? So it's very important that we understand that. Now, let's look at what we mean by belonging, right? It infers that an equitable structure is in place and functioning to make all people, no matter their differences, feel welcome. Now, I don't know if that is ever possible. Can we make all people feel welcome, no matter their differences? I don't think so, right? Because we're living in a world, even in the biblical, uh, you know, worldview, right? The Bible said that we should shun all forces of evil, right? All appearances of evil, right? So the Christian, for example, cannot welcome everybody. Well, we welcome everybody in the sense that we understand that we're all humans, but we cannot tolerate, we cannot support unwholesome, spiritual values, right? So because the fact of the matter is that Christ has called us to be separate. And to be separate doesn't mean that you are going to be disrespectful, right? But you might not be accepting, right? I can respect you for your decision to do what you think is right. I can respect you for your decision to embrace a certain value, but I might not respect or support or value that sort of, behavioral practice that you have embraced. And this is what we have to understand. But the world is forcing us that we need to accept everything irrespective of our belief systems. When you reach for equity, you're striving for a system that benefits everyone, no matter their circumstance. Belonging is when this not only works, but no one feels as if their inclusion is questioned. Now, this sounds to me like communism. Equity, diversity, and inclusion all mean different things, but interact with and rely on one another. Equity is the goal of diversity. and inclusion. And let's look at justice. Is the mission of equity in which an equitable system works so well, it eventually eliminates the systemic problems driving the need for the latter. In other words, everything is fairly and evenly distributed to people, no matter their race, gender, physical ability, and other personal circumstances. Now, this is not practical. This is not a pragmatic, philosophy, because we understand that our society is unequal in many respects. Now, we can aspire, but we'll never reach equity because we all have different talents, we all have different gifts, right? And we know that we cannot distribute, the resources we can't distribute the resources equitably because individuals have different talents and abilities, right? So if, for example, if I have studied and I have, done numerous studies in engineering, philosophy, whatever, right? There are people who are multi-talented, and how can you think that you're going to divide the resources equitably when there's another person who might not be as talented as I am? How is that going to happen? That should be the question that we are posing to these global elites, because obviously these elites are behind the sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion movement. What they're doing, however, is to wage this cultural war among global citizens, right? That we will eventually be divided. And whilst we are divided, then they can conquer us, they can control us. And that's what is happening with the world right now. These global elites, by no stretch of the imagination, believe in these, philosophy of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? They just don't believe that, right? And we can, as we have said before, we can see the manner in which they treat other people from other countries, even within from their own countries, right? That these elites sometimes kill, they wage wars, right? They create famine, right? And other, human disasters, right? So how could they possibly want us to live in an equitable society? During COVID, it was reported that billions of dollars were transferred from the middle class to the upper echelons of society, right? Billions of dollars, right? So how is our society striving for such equity? It is impossible based on what we are seeing. So there has to be another agenda than what we are hearing about. And, oftentimes we talk about the DEI and the whole matter of their striving to make us equitable, or for us to become an equitable society. I just wanted to read for you something that I saw in the Guardian newspaper about Claudine Gay and this diversity, equity, and inclusion doctrine, right? Because that's what it is, a doctrine. And I dare say it's a religious doctrine. It's not even a secular doctrine. It has a religious, sort of value system. Now, let's look at what she says. Gay's opponents have made little effort to hide that they are less interested in plagiarism than in wielding it as a weapon. Thus, in turn, has led many on the left to deny that Gay did much wrong. The fact that Gay's plagiarism is being exploited by the right does not make it any more acceptable, nor does the fact that, as with free speech, there is considerable right-wing hypocrisy. Many of those denouncing Gay, having previously defended conservatives, such as Supreme Court Judge Neil Gorsuch, facing the same charge. Now, let's move on to this diversity, equity thing. It is possible and necessary to push back against conservative bad faith actors without brushing aside the misdeeds of their targets. To do otherwise is to yield more weapons to the right. Now, so much about plagiarism and all of that, because perhaps if the so-called white professors, the ones who from the other Ivy League schools, were to be also investigated, maybe they would also see aspects of plagiarism, right? Who to tell? And this is why some people are saying that we can't just, look at Claudine Gay and talk about Claudine Gay and her plagiarism, but we have to also investigate the entire academic faculty in the United States, right? To see whether or not they might have had a history of plagiarism. Blacks as well as whites, as well as Asians, right? Because we are humans, right? And sometimes white people like to set themselves as a standard when they are not a standard, right? And oftentimes they are not as intellectually charged as they think they are, right? We are all human beings, and I'm not condoning, right, the misdeed of plagiarism. Right? I do believe that people should abide by the rules and regulations of institutions once they do not conflict, all right, with one's moral, values. All right. So let me just make that very clear to you. However, I think that when they're talking about Claudine Gay and pretending as if she's the only one that is guilty of plagiarism, or pretending as if Blacks and minorities are the only one who are guilty of plagiarism, I beg to differ because I know better. Now, here we have for many conservatives, taking down Gay is also to undermine diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, which have become central to the operation of universities. Gay's Harvard presidency has been marked by her promotion of DEI policies. So she was also a promoter of the DEI policies. Now, the problem with the DEI policies is that you have people on the right, which are, let us, in the context of the United States, are Republicans, right? For those of you who don't know, the political right in the United States are people who belong to the Republican Party. And the ones who are on the left are people who belong to the Democratic Party, right? Now, the fact of the matter is that there is racism on both sides, right? If you look at the logic behind this diversity, equity, and inclusion movement, and I shall call that a movement or a religion, all right? The fact of the matter is, on the right, they're against diversity, inclusion, and equity because they say that one should be promoted based on their merit, all right? So they're looking at the whole process of meritocracy. The fact of the matter is that most white people, when you look at it, do not really get their positions based on meritocracy, right? And so look at President Bush, and we can talk a whole of Donald Trump's and lots of other people who have attained to very high positions, whether economically or politically, or right, in some ways socially, and they had not done so, or they have not done so by the whole process of meritocracy, right? The United States, for the most part, is built as an oligarchy, right? So depending on your status, your family background, the color of your skin, etc., etc., etc. And we don't have to go back to the history, even after the Civil War, when white people, so-called white people, even those in the South who were very, very poor and destitute, right? They got land, the Homestead Act, right? Which Black people didn't get, right? They didn't work for the land, they got them free of charge, and they were able to build economically, right? We talk about the GI Bill, right, after World War II, and the lots of opportunities that, so-called white people received, right, that Blacks didn't receive, right, and it was not done based on meritocracy, right? So we've got to understand that. Now, we can talk about the Ivy League schools also, where many white people, and we don't have to even go into the fact that many of them sometimes are, because, they are wealthy, right? So they're able to hire very well-paid tutors, some of which are professors and perhaps people who also make up these exams, and they're able to prompt them and to prepare them adequately so that they can score well on these exams. Sometimes it's not because they're intellectually smarter than, say, a Black or Asian or Hispanic student. It's because the opportunities that they have outweigh that of, and sometimes I'm saying through an indirect method, they cheat in terms of having persons who might have links to people who might know what's going on, coming on the exam, and they're able to prompt them into, answering the questions on the exam. And I'm not saying that they have to directly give them the same exam, but if you're prompting students and you know what's going to be on the exam and you have those sort of connections, then you will be able to have your students pass these exams. I remember Eric Weinstein, and he is a mathematician in the United States. He went to Harvard University, and I think that's where Eric did his PhD, right? And he spoke about his brief time as a lecturer, as a math lecturer at Harvard University, and how these, the students who were there, they just wanted you to prompt them in terms of giving them things that didn't require them to justify how they had arrived at the answer. So he liked to give math questions in which the students had to argue, right, how they arrived at the answer. And he said that, quite frankly, most of them would fail because they just did not know how to do that, how to be able to elucidate on a mathematical problem and to justify the reason for, for the answers that they have arrived at, right? What they were so accustomed to doing was just simply to, get the math problem and to just arrive at the answer quite quickly, right? But he wanted them to write a complete process, justify how they arrived at that answer. And he said that many of the students, when you give them that challenge, are not able to do it, right? And he's not itemized. Well, of course, the majority of students at Harvard are whites, right? So we tend to give and to put on a pedestal these academic institutions. But let's not digress, because I just want so much for diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Because the whole process that the right wants to believe that white people get their positions so because they deserve them, right? And Blacks don't. Shall I also say, before I move on, that for those who are on the right and they're speaking like that, that white people also teach and work at Black universities, I beg your pardon. And they also attend there for college in terms of students, right? And a lot of the times they also are not as astute, right, as one would have liked to, but they get their positions based on also on their race in the United States and the whole colleges, the universities belief, right, in diversity, equity, and inclusion. So a lot of white people also at Black institutions, they go there even though they might not have been accepted based on merit. There are sometimes lots of minorities, lots of Black people who are far more qualified, right? And who do not get these positions at predominantly Black institutions, right? So the same stands true. So sometimes we think that, oh, it's only Black people that go to white institutions. And why do you think that that Black people or minorities, they only get positions at these so-called white institutions because, because they're academically incompetent, and that's what the image that they're giving us about Gay, that she's not, she does not have the scholastic aptitude, even though she went to two top elite institutions, Stanford and Harvard, right? But her capacity, she doesn't have the brain capacity, the mental capacity as that of her so-called white peers. that is ridiculous. Now, another thing is the Democratic Party, who argues that we are living in this, unequal society, right? And that we need to apply the, you know, we need to apply diversity, equity, and inclusion in all programs. But their racist agenda is the fact that the Democrats themselves do not believe that Blacks and minorities are competent. So they say, oh, let's be sorry for these, poor indigent people, and let's just give them some positions and let us say that, oh, we believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion, when they really don't believe in that. But what they want to do is promote the race as a lazy race, as a race that is inferior to whites, right? So when the Democratic Party speaks about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not because that they're less racist than the Republicans, right? The Republicans are arguing that one should get their positions based on meritocracy. But I would argue that many times, irrespective of your race, one does not get a position based on their on meritocracy, based on the whole system of meritocracy. A lot of times it has a lot to do with politics and the subjectivity of people, who people like and who people don't like, right? And that happens in all societies, not only in the United States, but in all around the world, right? So let's not just see it as an American problem. It's a human problem, right? That we like to give positions to people whom we like and not necessarily give it based on their meritocracy. And I'm not saying that in some cases, because you do have in some cases meritocracy in the United States. But we can say, when you look at these institutions, and if you teach at any of these institutions, or if you work in the United States, you see a lot of that, the politicking, the playing of this nasty politics, right? And that a lot of times it's not based on your competence, right? It's mostly based on the people that they think they like or that they can manipulate, right? That people that's the way how the world operates. Now let's look at what the author continues to say in this Guardian newspaper article. The moral face, let me see if I can get this. Is it my thing has gone? Right. The moral face, or the moral force, I beg your pardon, of the demand for diversity comes from the fact that many groups, racial minorities, women, gay people, and others, have historically been excluded from positions of power. DEI programs are seen as a push for a more equal society. It's interesting how Americans and even Europeans who are also joining line with the Americans, right, behind the Americans, are talking about racial minorities, and they include women and gay people, right? So I really wonder, so are so-called white men the majority, right? Are they the majority in terms of power? I guess that's what they're implying, right? And all of the people are minorities. Right? Interesting. Now, equality and diversity are not, however, synonymous. He's saying here, the greatest lack of diversity in America's elite universities is not racial, but class-based. There are almost as many students in Harvard from the highest earning 1% of society as from the poorest 60%. Studies suggest that diversity policies have improved prospects for middle-class African Americans, but not for those from disadvantaged backgrounds, right? Okay, so the very few who they have there, right? And to think that the very few Black people and minorities that Harvard attract are just people who could not have gotten into any other institution in the world is just ridiculous, right? Many times the people who they attract are very, very smart people, right? These minorities, that is, right? These are extraordinary smart people, right? Harvard is not going to take anybody, any Black person into their university, right? They just have a sprinkling number of Blacks on the campus anyway, right? So you think that they're going to just take a person who is barely able to, to read and write and to, um, to be able to go to their college? No, I don't think that that is going to happen, right? So where did we get this impression that these minorities who attend these elite institutions are getting their positions based on diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Because the whole tenet of this is to be able to say that Blacks have been disadvantaged. But these Black people or these minorities are of equal competence or higher to their white counterparts, right? So the Democratic Party tends to argue, and sometimes the Republicans, as if these Black people and minorities did not get their positions, did not gain admission into these elite institutions based on their academic competence, but just based on this diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think Black people need to take stock and understand that this diversity, equity, and inclusion movement is not for us, right? And that it's a movement that is geared at promoting us as incompetent people who deserve the pity and the sympathies of so-called Black people. I reject that categorically, right? Because I don't deserve any sympathy of any human being, right? Who are just dust, um, you know, of society, right? We know that we're all dust and we're all human beings. And some of us are smarter, whether you're Black or white or Asian, irrespective of who you are, right? It's not based on the color of one's skin. But Americans are so obsessive with skin color that sometimes they argue very illogically. And I often say that America is a progressive society, an advanced society, but when it comes on to race and ethnicity, it's almost like they're in the dark age. They have not yet come out of that age, right? And they can't think because all they can see is the color of a person's skin, which does not determine the content of the character, nor it does not determine how brilliant that mind is, or it does not determine how cultured that person is, right? But sometimes they just can't move beyond that understanding, right? And sometimes I have to put them in their places and let them understand that it doesn't work like that. You know, one's color of skin, the color of one's skin is not dependent on who the person is, right? But they have these ideologies, right? And these frameworks that they're working from, that it controls them. And as you peer into their faces, as you look deeply into their faces, you realize that they are controlled by what they perceive as, you know, reality because of their high levels of indoctrination. Now, white people, you've got to grow up. And you need to understand also that you're not white. You were just told that because, you know, the elites wanted you to join forces with them to make the global population feel that, you know, the elites are superior, but they don't really regard you also, right? It's you need to understand that, you know, whether you're white American or you're white Europeans, whether you think you are, because scientifically, nobody's white or nobody's Black. And we have said this on many occasions on this channel, and we need to get rid of that illusion, right? And to tether ourselves to reality, right? And that we are human beings and that we are all brown. We are all different shades of brown. Some are lighter shades of brown and some are darker shades of brown, right? If we get that into our cranium, I think that we will be able to unite as a people, as a human race, not as different races. We have different ethnicities, we have different linguistic groups, right? Which we have spoken, we have different national groups, right? But we don't have races, right? That is ridiculous, right? And that is why America is so divided, because it looks upon people as race. If they would just look at their common American identity, then they would be able to move forward. Now, Gay herself is emblematic of what diversity has come to mean. Her father, Sonny Gay, is vice president of Haiti's major construction company, right? So it makes him a part of the diversity agenda, right? even though these people might even be superior in intellectual acuity than many of their so-called white counterparts. She attended Phillips Exeter Academy, the most elite of America's elite boarding schools, and a feeder for Harvard. So she went to some very elite schools that prepared her as well for her academic pursuits and success. Gay may have changed the color of the mold, academic Tyler Austin Harper wrote, but she sure didn't break it. Now, when we give these sort of, diversity, equity, and inclusion programs or movement, we've got to really delve deeper into what they signify. What is their real agenda? Where do they want the world to be in the next, probably, let's say 10 years from now, right? We've got to do more assessment, and we can't just join this bandwagon, right? And think that these people have, real good motives, right? Because when we look at the reality of the world, we are seeing to a large degree where people are getting, more and more unequal in many respects, socially, economically, right? In many aspects of our lives, right? And the pandemic even accelerated that sort of, inequity in our societies, right? And these global elites love that, right? Because their purpose is to take the little that we have worked hard for and put it in their pockets. If anybody, I should say, does not deserve what they have are the global elites. Because if you look behind the scenes, many of them have not worked for what they have, right? They have used elements of the legal system in our countries to siphon off the wealth from the lowest to the middle into their hands, right? And we need to understand that. They are the ones who are incompetent for the most part. They are the ones who do not deserve what they have, and for the most part, have not gotten it through a system of meritocracy. Now, the fact that Harvard University and these elite institutions are practicing diversity, equity, and inclusion is ludicrous, right? Because we know that they're not, right? Most of these graduates are the ones who they graduate and they run the military-industrial complex of the United States, right? And if you understand clearly the quest for full spectrum dominance of the US military-industrial complex, you'll understand that they are the ones, these graduates, who go out into the world and formulate these toxic foreign policies, right? So much for diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? This agenda is not an authentic one. It is not an agenda that is going to save the world. It's going to cause or create more friction, more division among different societies, right? It's time for us to wake up. It's time for us to delve deeper, and it's time for us to rise up against forces who are trying to destroy our common humanity. Thank you so much for joining. I look forward to seeing you in another chat when we meet next time. All the best. Bye.